Well, I'm so glad that you could join us again for another True Crime Files of Los Angeles Inside Story. Now, for the last several podcasts, we've been talking about various problems in the criminal justice system. Criticism about how well the criminal justice system actually works. And we talked about the mentally disturbed individuals that have to be prosecuted and go through the court system. And then we spent a number of podcasts talking about sentencing and the issues that come up in sentencing. Now we want to address the subject of drugs and narcotics in the court system. So the best way to look at it is that the criticism falls into this category. There's too much time is spent on drug cases. Some truth in that. And as far as litigation, there's a lot of hearings in drug cases, as far as the legality of the search or the seizure of the drugs. And there is a criticism regarding minorities being prosecuted and convicted more often than none. And finally, I think the easiest thing to say, there's a lot of drug cases that come through the criminal justice system. So people who like to classify different types of crimes, they like to say victim crimes and victimless crimes. And it's easy. Victim crime, obviously, if you have a murder, if you have a robbery, a rape, you have a victim. You know who the victim is. But drug cases, you don't have a victim per se. And in prostitution cases, and gambling cases. So yes, you could make the argument that it's a victimless crime. And some of the studies that have been done have indicated that almost 3/4 of the cases in the criminal justice system are due to victimless crimes, such as drugs. So that really does affect the entire criminal justice system, how well it works, and how it gets bogged down on certain types of cases. Now, I don't want to address the question as whether drug use is a victimless crime, because people have feelings both that it is, and there's a lot of people feel that it is not. So let's get into what we want to talk about. And the approach from the libertarians is that they say, well, if you're an adult, you should be able to do what you want. If you want to take drugs, okay, then you take it and you suffer the consequences if you don't use them properly. So the libertarian approach would be, you can legalize all drugs. Maybe not for juveniles or minors, but otherwise it's up to every individual to decide what they feel is appropriate. Now, some of you will talk about the Netherlands. Over in Holland, they have, you could kind of call it a drug-free zone. I've been in Amsterdam a number of times, that when you go down to the Dam Square, you see the people that are kind of like space cadets. I mean, they're bombed out on various types of drugs. Now, in the Netherlands, they talk about soft drugs and hard drugs. And the soft drugs are considered a health problem. That's the marijuana and things of that nature. But heroin and cocaine are considered hard drugs. And that is enforced a little bit more. But the whole concept in Holland is that it's a health problem. And it should not be in the criminal justice system. So that's an approach that, is in Holland and is, I don't know whether it's worked all that well, but they claim that they have less overdose and they are able to treat people and it's not as deadly. Anyway, I want to approach the subject of drugs and narcotics in 3 parts. This podcast today, we're going to talk about personal use of drugs. And then next week, we're going to talk about the sales and the manufacturing, transportation of drugs and narcotics. And the final podcast will be on enforcement and investigation. So let's get involved in the one today, and that's the personal use of drugs. Now, we can think of personal use in 2 forms. One is that somebody who is highly intoxicated, we call it drunk in public, yeah, that's kind of a crime. It is on the books. You can be arrested for that. Same thing, driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol is a crime. Those is not exactly what we want to talk about. What we want to talk about is the individual, personal use. Can a person use drugs legally in their home, or should they be able to? Is that a crime to use drugs in a person's home or on their own property or even in a public place? So let's get started. And in order to talk about this, we have to talk about how do drugs affect an individual. It affects their mind as well as their body. And they fall into these categories: depressants, we have stimulants, hallucinogenics, then we have maybe a designer club, more recreation type drug, and then we have the opiates, the fentanyl. So those are the various categories. I think the easiest way to understand drug use is to use specific examples. And I'm going to use several cases that I worked on. I know the inside story as to what happened. The first one I want to talk about is NICOLE Smith, her use of drugs. Most of you are familiar with who she was, but she had back pain, very, very intense back pain. And why? Well, she was a topless dancer, and she noticed that all the other dancers were making the tips. They had the big breasts, and she thought, well, why don't I have implants, and I'll have large breasts, and I'll get the big tips. And she did it. But she kind of went to the extreme. She had the largest implants she could possibly have, and there's a price she paid for that. And that was chronic back pain that she had from then on. So, you know, how is she going to survive? I mean, she's got the back pain that is excruciating. So she found doctors, and she found a doctor out in the San Fernando Valley who was willing to prescribe pain medication for her. And they were opiates at the beginning, and benzos, seizure meds, and she started taking them and took more of them, and he prescribed more for her. And she became addicted to it, and she liked it, but you know, it affected the rest of her life. There were side effects for taking that much medication. So you can see it was like codeine and Vicodin at the beginning, but I like to put it in various categories. And when I was setting it up for trial, I wanted the jury to be able to see what categories. And these are the benzos that were prescribed to her, and some of those you'd be familiar with. And then there was another set of opiates, and they got involved with codeine, which is trying to be a replacement for the Vicodin, but she got more dependent on it and more dependent on it. And eventually she realized she had to get some help for it. And she went to the Betty Ford Center for detoxification. And they worked with her, and she started to improve. However, she still had the back pain, and she reverted back to those drugs. She got other doctors to prescribe these drugs to her, but this time it was in larger quantities. So this was what was happening, and it became very noticeable. In 2004, there was an award show, and she was supposed to present some award. She's up there on stage, and she throws her hands up in the air and says, "Like my body," in very slurred speech, and everybody in the audience and on TV realized that NICOLE had a drug problem. And it wasn't too much after that, it became apparent that she was pregnant. Wow, what is she going to do? Is she going to be able to carry the baby? Is it going to do damage to the baby? And at that point she realized she had to do something serious. And this time she went to Cedars-Sinai Hospital. They had a detoxification program there. She got the top doctor, and the doctor realized the problem was that methadone, and they realized if they got her off the methadone, that would cause seizures to the fetus. And it would be much better to kind of wean her off of the benzos. And that's what they did. And that went on for, almost a week. But as soon as she left, she was back using, and she got another doctor to give her methadone again and benzos. So she couldn't stop. She couldn't stop. And during the pregnancy, there were photos of her doing, really acting very bizarre. She was always highly intoxicated during this pregnancy. And the fear was, how is that going to affect the baby? So she had to leave the country, and she went down to the Bahamas, and she's down there and she gives birth in September of 2006. And it appeared that the baby was normal, or appeared normal at birth. And she was excited. She was happy. She had a daughter, and that's what she wanted. It was very, very important to her. Now, she had a son who was most likely about 20 years old, but she always wanted a girl. And so she's in the hospital there, giving the birth. She's happy, ecstatic, and she calls her son up in Los Angeles and asks him to fly to the Bahamas to be with her. And he does. Danny gets on a plane, he flies there, and he's staying right there in the hospital room with his mother, the boyfriend, and his baby sister. What could be better? So they're all in the room, and they're tired. They go to sleep. The next morning, they all wake up, except Daniel didn't wake up. He died of an overdose. And when they did the autopsy, they realized it was an overdose of methadone. There was methadone in that bag that she always had next to her with all the drugs that she carried. And you can imagine, the effect this had on Anna Nicole. She was just desperate to find something to take away the pain of the loss of her son. She was so depressed. And she talked to a neighbor who was a psychiatrist and said, could you prescribe something? Could you get something for me? I can't sleep. I don't know what to do. And the psychiatrist, okay, I will get some medication for you, and I'll come down to the Bahamas. And the psychiatrist went to a pharmacist in the San Fernando Valley, and she goes in there and says, I'm Anna Nicole Smith's doctor, and I want some chlorohydrate, a bottle of chlorohydrate. And I really always admire that pharmacist. He said, you don't want to be on the cover of the National Enquirer, do you? I mean, he was aware how dangerous chlorohydrate is, and he would not sell it to the psychiatrist. But eventually the psychiatrist is able to get drugs from another pharmacy, take them down to her in the Bahamas, and this, she was able to survive through all this depression with the drugs that were being given to her. And the baby was coming along, growing up. And by this time, I just put this together to show you what drugs she was getting. The benzos, the muscle relaxants, the sleeping aid, and the opiates. So it was quite a group of drugs that she was taking. And after about, 6 months after the birth and the death of her son, it's decided that they will go to Florida, Fort Lauderdale area, to the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino. And she's over there, and she isn't feeling well, but she's taken a lot of drugs. And she's in the room, and this is the room. That morning, everybody is going out to get the boat, and all of a sudden, nobody's paying attention to her, and it's about 11 o'clock, somebody comes in and checks on her, and she's not breathing. Anna Nicole's not breathing. They call the paramedics, and they take her to the hospital, and she's dead on arrival. So when they did the autopsy, what did they find in her system? It was like a pharmacy store, everything. But chlorohydrate was there, was one of the drugs that killed her. So you can see the danger. Now back to what we were talking about originally. The use of drugs, is this a victimless crime? But here we have Anna Nicole, who dies of these drugs. Her son Daniel, who also died of these drugs. So I don't think we can say the use of drugs is totally a victimless crime. Now let's move on to another case that I'm quite familiar with, and I think you're familiar with, and that's John BELUSHI, use of drugs. Most of you are familiar with that. He certainly talked about on top of the world. In 1979, he had the very top TV program. That was Saturday Night Live. He had the top movie, Animal House, and he also had the top album that year, Blues Brothers, Briefcase Full of Blues. So you can imagine the pressure that was on him to perform, to be funny, to please people. So for him, drugs, alcohol, that was what relieved the stress of all of the pressure on him. And he craved it, and he used it more and more. Now he's out on the Sunset Strip. He's at the Chateau Marmont Hotel. He's staying there in 1982. He has a bungalow there, and he's going on the Sunset Strip all night long, the early morning hours, to all the different venues there. And he does that, and he is kind of a groupie of people coming along with him, wanting to be a part of John BELUSHI. Eventually, they end up over at his room at the chateau, and it's a little bungalow there, and he meets up with this other lady there, Kathy Smith, and BELUSHI was into cocaine. He liked to shoot up cocaine. She, on the other hand, liked to shoot up heroin. So she knew that you could combine the two, and it was called speedballs. So she was showing him how to take speedballs, and he was doing it. He was injecting himself with it. And then eventually, as morning came, the others in the room decided, let's go get something for breakfast. And they leave, and John BELUSHI is in there with Kathy Smith, and we don't know exactly what happened, but the next thing, when everybody came back, they found that John BELUSHI was dead on the floor of that bungalow. He'd overdosed. And what was it an overdose of? The coroner, when it looked at it, said acute cocaine and heroin addiction. In other words, those speedballs that he took turned out to be deadly. Now the question was, who should be held accountable for that? That lady who was there, Kathy Smith, did she inject him? Well, that was always a problem. That was the issue. Did she prepare him? It kind of indicated she was there, and the drugs were there, and nobody else was there. So it must have been her, but they couldn't prove that she was the one that injected it in his veins. However, what happened was she went on television up in Canada, and she admitted that she gave BELUSHI the speedballs. And that was enough right there. With that information, we were able to use that statement in court against her. So there was a case that was made, and she's prosecuted for it. And eventually, when it came time for trial, she pled no contest to manslaughter, and she was sentenced to 3 years in state prison. So again, our statement was, is drug use a victimless crime? Well, we have a dead person, and we also have a person who's spending 3 years in prison as a result of that. Now, I want to go on about Hollywood and the use of drugs. Well, Hollywood has always been known for use of drugs, especially cocaine, very popular in the motion picture industry. And I want to talk about one in particular. It involves Roy Radin, who was a producer, and Robert Evans, also a producer, and how their two lives came together. I think many of you might remember Robert Evans. He was the head of Paramount Studios, and he had a lot of big productions. Back in 1972, he was involved in The Godfather being produced, and he was very close to Jack Nicholson, and he did Chinatown. So a lot of big movies, but he was heavy into cocaine. He liked his cocaine, and it kind of affected his career, and it affected his marriage as well. So he had some difficulty with it, and he had a comeback. And it was a movie, Wag the Dog, was named about him coming back into the Hollywood scene. And he did. And as to Roy Radin, he was a producer of vaudeville productions. And he would take the old TV stars, and he would transport them across the entire United States, doing little productions in small towns. Made a lot of money at that. But he wanted to be a big Hollywood producer. And he had gotten the word that there was a story out called the Cotton Club, about a Harlem nightclub. And he wanted to get the rights to that so that he could be the producer of that as a Hollywood production. Now, Roy was into drugs, especially cocaine. He liked the cocaine, but he did it in a recreational area. And when he's in Hollywood, he would get it from LANIE Jacobs. She was really the supplier of drugs in Hollywood. And that worked well for him. She was also the supplier for Robert Evans as far as cocaine. So that's the connection between this drug dealer. And he owned the rights to the Cotton Club story. So now you can see the two of them are negotiating back and forth. That Reardon wants the rights, Evans has the rights, and it is LANIE who is, kind of brokering the deal between them. And they worked for, many months trying to get things worked out. It didn't work out. However, in the meantime, LANIE, she was heavy into the dope business, and 10 kilos of cocaine were ripped off from her house in the San Fernando Valley, as well as thousands of dollars. She didn't know who had ripped her off, but she was livid, and she wanted to find out who it was. Now, she had gotten the word that Roy Radin, he might be the one who would know about it. He may not have, stolen all the drugs, but he would know who was involved in it. So she hired 2 hitmen to go after Reardon, and that was their job. They find him, they take him out to the desert, and they shoot him many times, 17 times they shoot him, and that's where his body is found months later. So what am I talking about? It all revolved around the use of cocaine. And you say victimless crime? Well, I don't know whether you really consider it a victimless crime, in that he was dead because of his connections to the dope dealer who had been ripped off, and her connections to Robert Evans. So let's go on, let's do one more as far as use, because this one involves an attorney from New York. He does very well. He does criminal defense work back there. doing well in it, but he meets a young lady who wants to go to the West Coast, to California. So he goes with her to California, and he's trying to start, a new career out there. He doesn't have a license to practice law, but he's trying to take the bar, having difficulty with it. But he's making a lot of money in the stock day trader market. So, he wanted to live well, and he found that he could, live on top of the world. He got a very nice home at the very top. If you know where Sunset Strip is, if you took the road up from the Sunset Strip to the very top of the Hollywood Hills, that was where his house was. And you couldn't have it any nicer. He had the fastest cars, the nicest cars, fastest women, and he had all the cocaine you could ever want. It was always party time, party time, party time. So life was good for him, and he met this Christy Baldwin. And Christy Baldwin was at various jobs, and she was impressed with this attorney from the East Coast, and she hung out with him. He was a lot of fun because always party time. He used a lot of cocaine, and she didn't mind using some of his cocaine. It made her feel good. However, he would get violent at times when he had too much cocaine. And one night, she is over at his house on top of the Hollywood Hills, and he becomes very belligerent. He's had too much cocaine. And there's an argument between them, and she wants to go home. She says, "Just take me home." And he refuses to. He says, no, I don't want to go driving and taking you home. And so she's on the floor there, and he's, tired of her. And he goes over to the closet there, and he takes out a revolver. He takes one bullet, puts it in the revolver, and he spins it. Closes it up, and he puts the gun up against her temple and pulls the trigger. Nothing happened. It was fun. He laughed, and he does it again. And eventually the gun goes off and shoots her right through the head. She's dead. She dies right there. Bleeds out on his red carpeting. Well, he eventually, in the middle of the night, takes her body up to the Daggett area near Barstow, and puts her body under a culvert there so it wouldn't be found. Eventually it was found because of a storm, and the body came out, and he was tracked down. So was this use of cocaine a victimless crime? Well, it wasn't a victimless crime as far as Christy Baldwin. Now, I'd just like to include all of these that we've talked about. At the beginning, we talked about, is drug, narcotics usage a victimless crime? And I know many of you feel it is, and that the criminal court system shouldn't be involved. And the criminal court system would love to get out of the drug business, because it does occupy a lot of the time and effort of the courts. But you have Anna Nicole and Danny, her son, they're dead because of an overdose. We have Roy Reardon, who used cocaine with Robert Evans. He ends up dead. John Belushi, we also know what happened to him, an overdose of cocaine and heroin, and the lady who injected him. And then we have the attorney from New York. He comes out here and gets high on cocaine and shoots and kills Christy Baldwin. Well, I think we really have to take a hard look at all of this and make a determination. What do we want to do about those crimes? Are they really crimes that should be prosecuted in the criminal justice system? Anyway, so today we talked about personal use of drugs. In our next podcast, we're going to be talking about sales, manufacturing, and cultivating, and transporting. And then eventually we will talk about enforcement and investigation of narcotic and drug cases. So hopefully this was informative to you, and you'll join us for another True Crime Files of Los Angeles Inside Story, when we continue to talk about drugs and narcotics in the criminal justice system. See you then.